Well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My warmest welcome to another ECIPE summer webinar. And this time it's on a very timely topic of US industrial policy. And well, as we have seen coming out of Washington and everything that divides Washington for the moment, we can clearly see that the technological superiority or maintaining it and the challenge coming from China is one of the issues that is really not dividing along the party lines in the US, where there's one of the very few areas where there's a common view between the two parties in the US politics. My name is Jose Climaquema, Director of ECIPE. You may have seen my work in this area around 5G, security and trustworthiness in industrial policy in recent years. And I'm actually very, very delighted to invite two of my favorite authors and inviting them to talk about US strategy going forward in technology, but also in particular in network technology and what it actually entails for the rest of the world. We are today joined by Roslyn Layton, a longtime thought leader on US telecom policy. And I have seen her name more than anyone else's pop up in FCC dockets and actually write them much better than I do myself. Once briefly in US government, now professor at Aalborg University, partner of Strand Consult, columnist of Forbes Magazine, and founder of China Tech Thread. I hope I haven't missed anything because your CV is quite extensive. Roslyn, are you with us? Can you hear us? And do you have still problems with the audio? Can you? I
can hear you, Hosu. Can you hear me?
Thank you.
Are you able to get me?
Yeah, we can hear you clearly. And
Fantastic.
I should also take the opportunity to apologize to the audience and to Roslyn because we had some audio problems with this new software we're using. So apologies to you all that we had started 5 minutes later. And the second speaker we have today is, do I dare to say the #1 China tech, should I say a leading expert on China's tech aspirations and maybe the enfant terrible of China Twitter, and former professor at Shenzhen HSBC Business School of PKU in the heart of China's Silicon Valley. Christopher Balding is joining us to talk about what US tech strategy and US Innovation and Competitiveness Act entails for this space and what it entails for the China relationship. But I'd like to go to you, Roslyn, first, because we have now a huge piece of an omnibus legislation that will redefine probably the US industrial policy for many, many years ahead. And it contains at least 250 billion of investments, at least in that range of all sorts of emerging technologies, and that mixes direct support with all the instruments like National Science Foundation, as well as free market elements. This huge piece of legislation we call the US Innovation and Competitiveness Act. So please, Roslyn, do guide us through what are we looking at, what is it, and why is it here? And should we Europeans be worried? Please take the stage.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. I'm thrilled to join Chris and you. You two are some of my heroes. So thank you for this time today. When we look at this new piece of legislation, this Technology and Innovation Act, I think it's interesting that it passed on a vote of 68 to 32, which in some cases is a wide margin on the circumstances. You know, China policy is one area of bipartisan agreement in the U.S. today. But what's interesting is that those who voted against it were largely the China hawks in Congress on the Republican side. Someone like Marco Rubio wanted to have amendments for guardrails because they were concerned that the money that's being appropriated, $1.5 billion for Open RAN technologies, for example, that this money would be usurped by Chinese actors. And I think that that is really the key concern with this legislation, because already we know that there's 44 companies involved in the Open RAN effort, 7 of which are already on the U.S. entity list. So this technology has not been vetted by the either U.S. or EU authorities, and it's already being touted by some as the answer to the Chinese problem. I think it's quite premature. Senator Rubio is right to be concerned. We've seen in other cases where money's been appropriated and it will be taken by Chinese actors, that there's not the appropriate controls in the U.S. government to vet who is receiving the subsidies. And already you're seeing big American companies lining up like Intel, you know, it's sort of free money for them. So it's not so much a free market in my perspective, it's more corporate welfare, that's maybe business as usual. I think it's very much in the line of your founder there at ECIPE. He's talked about, you know, this innovation illusion, that why are we doing so much and getting so little? I mean, why aren't the large corporations putting the skin in the game? They, instead of, you know, the taxpayers footing the bill for the innovation that they should be doing. And just then the final thing I'd say is this concept, this paradigm, the way that the bill is written is really from a prior age in science. It's this very state-centered, big science idea where the government should drive the innovation agenda. And if you look at space today, it's being driven by entrepreneurs, innovators. It's not NASA calling the shots, it's Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and Richard Branson and so forth. They're the ones sending, you know, tourists into space. So I would say, you know, this is in some respects par for the course, where big companies get to, you know, use the government as a front for the money that they should spend. But, you know, I do hope that we have other opportunities to have true innovation and not, you know, government picking winners.
Oh, that's really interesting. And you homed in on, well, first of all, you mentioned Open RAN, which has a very, let's say, diverse constituents of both US, European, Chinese companies. That is sort of the mainstay. And you also had the CHIPS Act. And it's interesting that you mentioned one of the companies. And is there a sense that we are now looking at US, I don't want to say throwing the towel on market economy, but if you can't beat state capitalism, be state capitalism? Can I call, would we take that far? Or are we picking some elements of all the aspects, well, basically the entire ideological spectrum, and try to create a 1980 style? You call it big science, and you know, we probably haven't heard that term in 30 years, and I'm not even sure the European audience that's joining us today is even familiar with the concept of the state-led market innovation, well, ecosystem that exists in the US, especially around the space race and the semiconductor research back in the 80s. And is that a return to Reagan era? We're just changing Andropov for Xi Jinping. Is that what we're looking at?
Is that a question for me, Hosuk? So I think in some respects it's a half-hearted way to play catch-up, because other critiques of this policy is that the amount of money is not even enough. I mean, if we look at what China's spending, that we need to spend 4 or 5 times that, on order of $300 to $400 billion to be meaningful. You know, I guess what I'd say is I think that corporations should put more skin in the game. And, you know, the larger issue is to what degree we can have manufacturing in the U.S. It is in many cases a lost cause. There are some efforts to try to restore manufacturing in the U.S., particularly in semiconductors. There is definitely the design element. It's very strong. But you know, now it's the question of what risk are we willing to take? I think there may be a positive sign. Just this morning, there was noted the intent perhaps to nominate a man by the name of Alan Estevez to the key role in the Department of Commerce, Undersecretary for Bureau of Industry and Security. And that person is coming out of the Defense Department. That is really a first. and it signals that there's seriousness to take the security issues, to take them seriously, as opposed to, what does business want at this point in time.
Interesting. I note here that, aside from the CHIPS Act and the ORAM, which accounts for about around $50 billion, you also have, we should say, around $150 going into, let's say, classic U.S. industrial policy element like the NSF. We have appropriation of, authorization of appropriation for DOE to beef up STEM education. We have a variety of things, and we shouldn't actually delude ourselves that actually it's zero state funding in the US. That's not the way it works. There's always been an element of state activist intervention, but on a different level perhaps. And maybe, could I ask you a little bit about that? Is that element changing, that we are seeing now, as you mentioned, direct support to specific companies? That's certainly a new element. Roslyn?
Well, yes. So it is definitely significant. Now these institutes, the NIST, National Institute of Science Technology, National Science Foundation, they have been around. They have been funded over the years. They do important activities. There's no doubt about that. The issue here, though, is that in the meantime of, maybe other activities, China has amassed a significant military. The Defense Department has known this. They have, in many respects, tried to raise the raise the concern to Congress. But it really would say things didn't. There have been little steps here and there, but it's taken time to get everybody on board. You have, even within the Congress, you have different factions. You have the salvagers, the punishers, and the decouplers. Those who, for example, decoupling today is a serious mainstream movement that nobody considered 3 or 4 years ago. And today people say, well, we have to get out of China. But on the other hand, you could look at the bill as something of a salvaging, because even what's supposed to be the antidote to China, Open RAN, is actually involving China. And ostensibly, the American companies who would be making this Open RAN technology would be producing it in China with taxpayers' money. So that's, sort of what I'm talking about. Maybe on the surface, this sounds great. Oh, here we have a policy. But we look into the details and we find out there's so many layers where it's not what we think it is. And it's certainly not even more secure. In fact, it may be less secure because you have more vendors, you have more things you have to check out. This is adding additional touch points and attack surfaces. So, the question is this really an improvement? I think that, in a free market innovation, if that's what you're looking for, you would have a competition to say, reinvent the next generation of wireless services. You don't have the government pick the winners and assume, oh, Open RAN right out of the gate is the winner. There's nothing empirical that shows that.
Wow. So bifurcation leads to, I guess, displacement of traditional players and replacing them with a US/Chinese corporation. Wow, that's...
Well, the one now I will say one thing I think is positive. If you do look at the policy to Huawei, I think one of the key beneficiaries has been Samsung. Samsung was having a hard time getting into the base station market because of Huawei's predatory practices. They were, pricing in such a way, they had the state support, and Samsung couldn't get a foothold. That's no longer the case. And I think that, it's straight antitrust policy. If you have a predatory actor acting in an illegal way, acting with unfair and deceptive pricing, that is hurting competition. So the very fact of removing in the European markets a player that was playing unfairly, that has helped the legitimate players come to the fore. And you didn't have to have any subsidies involved. It was simply using the you could use classic antitrust to address that. Now, that was achieved through a different policy instrument, the Bureau of Industry and Security Entity List, to restrict Huawei, to put it on in such a way. But that, has achieved a valuable goal. And the larger success of that policy is if we look at many of Western industrial democratized countries, the share of Huawei has been significantly reduced. And I think more important is the public opinion. People now recognize, voters care about this issue. They recognize They don't want their data on an unsecure network. They don't want to have their information siphoned away to the Chinese government. And we're now recognizing the human rights angle of this, that we would say everybody deserves to have a Chinese-free network for their communications. It's not just, you know, NATO or the Defense Department or the people in Brussels or, you know, government officials. Everyone should have a right to not be surveilled, and certainly fits with the European Union's general data protection regulation around the rights of users to control their data.
Well, that brings us to a question of signal fusion and also the bigger picture around China's involvement in our supply chain. And that brings me to you, Chris, if I may. I started to see in your tweets, and as you said, you're a true rock star amongst the China watchers on Twitter and social media. And as I was researching into the Chinese telco players, I always noticed that there was like one guy 2 steps ahead of me, and that was Mr. Christopher Balding. And you have been looking at this space for quite some time. And before we get to the US response to the China challenge, you have published recently a paper on Open RAN as well that Roslyn and I just discussed. How do you see this bifurcation gravy train coming to the telco industry? Is this, I mean, Biden said America is back. And does it mean that America is actually back on the telco market? Are we looking at the new Lucents and the new Motorola's here? So tell us what's happening and how do you see this Open RAN coalition?
So I think one thing that is a lot of government policy ideas get started based upon some valid issue or concern, and then very quickly get bastardized in a way. And I think this is a classic example of that. If you are the United States and you are saying we believe Huawei and ZTE are significant security risks, basically, as Roslyn kind of pointed out, you're basically left with Nokia and Ericsson controlling probably 90% of the market. Now, I think Nokia and Ericsson are fine companies, but that does in any global market if you only have 2 competitors. And so I think where a lot of this Open RAN idea started from was focusing on, well, geez, we need to create a market where there is more than 2 competitors, really. And so they said, well, you know, one of the things we hear from telcos very frequently is they think that if they could actually replace components rather than having to buy an entire network front to back from, you know, one provider, that they could probably lower costs. In theory, it's probably not a bad idea. Okay, so that, you know, you could replace a base, this base station with this other firm's base station, and everything would still work perfectly together. In theory, I think that's not an absurd theory. In practice, I think it's turned into something very different for numerous reasons that are primarily focused on how policy was implemented and oversight. And I think from an industrial planning perspective in the United States, one of the things that they were effectively starting with was saying, well, wait a minute, we have all of these firms that are involved in all of these neighboring industries. Qualcomm in, you know, mobile chips, Intel in base station chips, Android in the operating systems. And so we have all of these firms that are involved in major slices of the neighboring industries, but we as the United States don't have firms specifically involved in this industry that are major players. So if we were to pressure the industry to open up, there's this belief that it would probably self-populate with some type of American firm, whether it was Intel and Qualcomm doing a JV to create a base station competitor to Nokia and Ericsson, whatever the situation might be. But this way, there was also this idea that we're not picking a winner, we're just opening the market up to greater competition, and an American firm is likely to self-populate into the industry.
I should just interject here, if I may. We talked about 3 players. You talked about 2. We have Samsung coming in, which is now currently the largest vendor of the 5G and our equipment now in the US market. So it provided a major opportunity for them. You have also Fujitsu and NEC, the Japanese players, and even Vietnam is actually trying to capitalize on the absence of Huawei and ZTE and coming into this space. So in other words, we are not really sure where this market developments are going in the traditional space, but in the addition, we have also the ORAM players that are coming in. But it seemed to me, at least looking at the list of companies, that there is one chipset company. So you're basically splitting the market rather than into verticals, into horizontals, that you have one virtualization partner, one cloud stack, and one. So you're basically redesigning the competitions that in a different direction. And that also.
Well, so can I add one? Yeah. May I add one thing on that? I actually find the policymakers' focus on the equipment market is really misplaced. If you look at the revenue and the cash flow, I mean, when we look at the 5G infrastructure or the RAN, just the radio access network, it's only 1 to 3% of the total ARPU for telecom operators. It's an extremely small part of their business and outlay. But versus the amount of policy focus is really over-focused. And this is a larger solution than the problem was warranted. In fact, I don't think it's a problem. The money in 5G is really in the services. And that is where the traditional platforms, the Google, Facebooks, the Spotify, those platform companies are the ones with the cash flow, and they have it in 4G and are positioned to win that in 5G. That we over-focus on the infrastructure market as if it is, so big and it's an issue. I mean, I feel that we addressed it when the Huawei was placed on the entity list. Over and done. We're done with that. We can move on. There are actually dozens of players, hundreds, in fact, in the infrastructure market at very different levels, in addition to software players. So that we're having to bend backwards to help large U.S. companies somehow now enter and become infrastructure players when they have the cash to do it, I think is misguided. We could be looking more at the service side of things. I mean, there's a lot of attention on the platforms, but, again, that's a different problem. And in that respect, the U.S. has the money, it has the cash flow, and those are the players positioned now to be the big winners of 5G. It's certainly not the operators. We know that for sure. Their share of the profits and the revenue will be very small.
Did you say 2-3% of the turnover, Roslyn?
1%, quite low, less than 5% of the total turnover of the telecom operator. In Europe, the amount of the 5G RAN market in Europe is about $3 billion a year.
Yeah, and I can tell you there are a couple of studies that basically said for the next couple of years, total 5G spend on infrastructure, on building out the 5G infrastructure, is going to be probably less than $10 billion total. So, we talk about this, but it's actually not, as Roslyn has correctly pointed out, it's not an enormous share of the overall spend.
Wow. So we are talking about...
And the pound for pound, what you can get from existing vendors today for the price and the quality of what you could get 10 or 20 years ago, it's just like all other things. It's the price for quality the quality has increased logarithmically and the price has fallen substantially. So the same base station can do many more things, where before you had to have multiple components. You can virtualize a lot of those things, so you get a lot more for your money. So I don't believe there's a competition problem in the market for the infrastructure today.
Well, that's a very good point. And I just wanted to add, we are talking about telcos that pay somewhere around 5 to 8%, twice the number you're talking about, in dividends to the shareholders. So, but I mean, hey, whether it's 1%, 2%,
and 25% in their marketing. I mean, if you look at it's cutthroat in the sense of the competition to get, the telcos are losing a large part of their customers every year just by the churn to other operators. So, this notion that it's not a competitive space, they have to spend 25% of their revenue just to keep their customers or to get the customers that they lose to their competitors.
I want to get back to Chris here because the the subject of this webinar today is America's 5G Gambit. And as we heard from Roslyn around the US Innovation and Competitiveness Act, it's really, really about bifurcation. That's the uniting drive. Is it working? Because as we hear, many of the recipients of these subsidies could very well be Chinese. And at least for my sensitive European ears, who are not really used to this kind of pork barreling at all, you know, and this kind of misfiring, it sounds implausible.
This is what is so interesting, is the entire ORAN project was basically started primarily to accomplish two things, and that was increased competition. And I think you would have to say that results are mixed. You know, strictly on the as a result of ORAN, there was probably greater introduction of competition from blocking Huawei and ECIPE. And so then you say, well, let's turn to the security issues and say, well, what, you know, how much has been accomplished focusing on the security aspect of ORAN? And I think if you're looking at the security focus of ORAN, I think you would have to consider it a pretty significant failure. And by that, I mean, you know, some of the, just to take a couple of points of reference, as Roslyn mentioned earlier, Senator Rubio and Senator Warners, who have been big proponents of ORAN, and I think it's fair to call both of them China hawks. They have talked at length about this. Senator Warner comes from a telecoms background. This was supposedly a focus of the ORAN legislation, but as was pointed out about senators that voted against the most recent version of this bill, there was a bill that passed in December, I think December of 2020 under the National Defense Authorization Act. If you actually read the legislation, there's nothing in there about, there's no specific explicit mandates about security. It references security issues in a very almost ephemeral way, meaning that grants will be overseen, and you know, a couple of the executive agencies that will be overseeing the grants are like, I believe it's the CIA or Defense Intelligence, something like that. But there is no explicit requirements, mandates about security. Okay, so what has happened is these grants were being given to either firms or industry bodies, and they said, well, hey, you know, we've invited Chinese firms to be members of the ORAN Alliance, and so since they're members of the ORAN Alliance, we're also going to maybe cooperate with them, and so they are receiving either directly or indirectly some of these subsidies that are going to promote the development of ORAN. Now, this is where it gets really crazy, is that some of these firms, as you pointed out in a tweet yesterday, now 7 of these firms are on some types of U.S. sanction list, entity list, CCP, or military ownership list. And so these are the firms that are heavily involved, and some of them are even coding the ORAN source code. Okay, and so the entire purpose of ORAN was to reduce dependency because the United States viewed China as a security risk. So the U.S. promoted standard is now returning it back to Chinese coders. How does that make any sense?
I just want to walk through this slowly so that I get it. So if I understand correctly, United States was already China free. So aside from a few fixed line installations, United States was basically China free, and now we have this new constellation to increase competition where there are Chinese members and they've developed a common code. And yes, some of that developed by Chinese and introduced into introduced into the United States, displacing mainly Korean and European players.
Yes, that's correct. We can say with certainty that Chinese coders are actually coding a material portion of the ORAN code, which is going to help all these, which is basically going to provide the code base so that whether, you know, whatever component your firm manufactures, it can immediately work, you know, with any other firm's connecting part. And so that is absolutely happening, and Chinese coders are coding a material portion of that overall code base.
All right. Could you tell us a little bit about the companies, and also because Huawei seems to be the benchmark, and I want to make it clear that Huawei is not the scope of the conversation we have today. And for those who are interested, Christopher has written a very well-researched paper about Huawei's ownership, etc., and there are contradicting views from the company as well, I should say, for to be completely objective on this. But if we use Huawei as a benchmark, I mean, who are these companies? I mean, they are obviously not Huawei because they're not members. So could you tell us a little bit about the companies in this constellation?
Sure. So the primary companies that we're talking about here, and I should say there's been a couple of, let me just pull up some notes here that I have on this. So there's a couple of companies, there's 7 companies which are currently under some form of US sanctions, either on the entity list or because they are have PLA links. And those companies are China Mobile, China Telecom, China Unicom, and to be fair, those are the 3 primary network service providers in China. So in a way, I think we're all aware that China is heavily state-owned, and those are the dominating firms for mobile and fixed line, as well as internet. So even if we say, okay, well, there's kind of some space there to exclude those firms, the other firms that we're talking about that are currently under U.S. sanction are ZTE, Inspur, Fidium, and Kindroid. And those firms definitely, I think there's even less doubt about those firms, about the types of activities that they are involved in. ZTE is directly owned by is at least significantly owned directly by a branch of the PLA. Inspur and Fidium are engaged in advanced research with everything from nuclear weapons to missiles and things of that nature. So these are not firms that, okay, China Mobile, okay, maybe that's not entirely what we would consider a security risk. So maybe that might be unfair. These other firms, I think there's very little wiggle room to say that they are not. But I think even arguably more significantly are what I would refer to as the 2nd and 3rd layer firms. And these are companies that people might not have heard as much about, such as Geotech, HD Tech, Tsinghua Unigroup and related entities, Certes Net, Rentech, CICT, Chengdu, NTS, Purple Mountain Labs. And these are firms that are in some way must be emphasized, not under any type of sanction or entity list designation, but these are firms that are either directly or heavily state-owned, or they are heavily involved with military and security activities. Geotech and HG Tech are clearly firms that are heavily involved in PLA-type research. HG Tech is actually owned primarily by a university, where evidence indicates that it's the same type of personnel or academic groups that do advanced research for the PLA. Purple Mountain Labs is a lab created by the government to handle internet security issues. Guangdong Communications is a provincial government institute on these types of issues. Tsinghua Unigroup is owned by Tsinghua University, which has all nature of PLA type of connections and professors that have started businesses that service security and intelligence apparatuses within China. And specifically, Tsinghua Unigroup actually has one firm that is on the U.S. entity list, not the firms that are in the ORAM alliance. And they are also charged specifically with basically replacing, changing China's dependence on foreign technology, specifically in the chip space and related areas. So these are heavily dominated state firms. These are not firms that have a little bit, they might work with the government, but these are heavily dominated and very closely linked with, I think, PLA security and other security entities. The last group of companies are ones that are, if you were to look at this, why are these companies on a global standard setting body like the ORAM Alliance? There's very little, they're almost puzzling. Some of these companies, they don't even have actual products yet. And so it's puzzling why they are even on an entity of this size and importance. And so I think this raises numerous very valid security issues about how China is involved in the ORAM Alliance and setting standards for telecom security globally going forward.
Wow.
May I piggyback on that, Jose?
Here, because I'm really curious to understand, is this by design? Is this intended? Is there an intention to invite these companies into the United States, or how do you see this?
I thank Christopher for doing the research and looking so deeply. I think that's very important. You need to know the organization. You need to know the companies. But you might suggest that this is a policy of salvagers, those who would want to salvage a relationship with China, that on the surface it looks like, oh, well, we're going to solve the Chinese problem, but in the background, you're working with Chinese companies. I would say that this is what animates the decouplers, the people who want to decouple from China, because as Christopher was explaining, everything is interconnected in China. There's no such thing as a non-state involved company in one way or another. And in practice, the laws in China, the intelligence and security laws, are such that any data collected on any device made in China can be commandeered, checked. It can be recovered by the government if that's what they want. So there's no sense of safety if you use any piece of Chinese technology. The mistake here is to think that, oh, if we just carve out these couple companies, everything's fine and we can continue, business as usual. But, I think that is a mistake. If you truly care about your privacy and your security, you have to think about a truly non-Chinese or a clean network, that you don't have Chinese software, you don't have Chinese laptops, you don't have Chinese base stations or any of those components. And, if we actually embrace that idea, we would look at what does it mean to produce our technology in democratic countries where we would have to work together. We would have to reinvest in manufacturing. We'd reinvest in those industries that we care about, not this notion of just let's have techno-religion like Open RAN because we call it open, that somehow means it's free or clean or something. That's not the case at all. It's actually a front to make us more unsafe than it is today, to give us a false sense of security that somehow we're doing the right thing. To get to a place where we have a clean network, it's hard to do. It's actually hard to do. It is, in many cases, the labor force is not there, the tax policy, the things that you need to actually produce the equipment, it doesn't exist. It has been outsourced away. But if you want to have it in a way that you can control it, that it is safe, that the supply chain is secure, you have to stop saying things like open and then continue the business as usual.
I want to ask a question from the chat, and I should also remind the audience here that the question and the chat is open, and I'll pick them up as they come up. There's one question that was posted by Guillermo Parada, who's just returning for Mobile World Congress in Barcelona. It's happening despite COVID, and saying that you can actually perhaps build a open RAN configuration just using US suppliers. But Chris, you suggested that the code is actually commonly developed, if I understand you correctly. And in the Open RAN Alliance, you have US, Europe, well, a couple of companies at least, and we have the Japanese and we have the Chinese. And security is very much a two-way street. And so whoever you are of these four, you probably think that I want to do it alone or with one more country or region in this the quad, if I may say, the 4 quarters of the ORAN. Is it possible just to do it US standalone? Or Chris, I started with you because you said that the code is commonly developed, and that's a very important point.
So I think if you were to say, could you do it with firms that have their headquarters in the United States? Yes, I'm sure you could. Could you do it with code that has no origination in China? Could you do it with components that have no origination in China? I'd be skeptical. Okay, because the code base is currently materially, at least in part, developed in China, and significant amounts of the actual manufacturing of these products is done in China. So it would be very interesting technically to see if you could do that and be completely China free.
Roslyn, I'll put the same question to you. Is it possible to have a purely indigenous supply chain, or just with people that America likes?
Well, I would not. I'd have no problem if you could make your equipment, however you call it, whatever it may be, and you produce it outside of China. That is what I'm talking about. Can you avoid the production in China? You can control all the. Let's say you even get the code. You can make it non-Chinese. If you produce in China, you are still at risk. You're still at risk for some kind of a sabotage or an infiltration or some kind of compromise. So, if you can do the production outside of China with non-Chinese actors, great, fantastic. Go have at it. You need to be able to produce it in a price effective way. Now I have heard of European producers in countries there are components that they are producing. I think it's fantastic. I think we should do everything we can to support those entities, tax breaks, incentives. We should, I have described some of them in my research as well. I think we should have more. That would be, if we went back to a mentality where we actually believed in producing things, that might be more common. The challenge today is that in many countries, China in particular, they have a large market. They seemingly make it easier, but my hope is that is changing. I think that there is a recognition. I don't want to dismiss the ethos. I think the ethos is correct, to recognize the threat, to want to have alternatives, but you have to walk through the alternatives. If this is just about big companies who have existing supply chains who just want to change the name on the product and then produce it in the same way and then say it's safe, then that's what I'm going against.
We have that's a very good answer, and we actually have a follow-up question to that, if I may, coming from Agustin Zoke. I apologize for the pronunciation if I got that wrong. But will China be able to manufacture without the 5G technologies, for example, like advanced chipsets? And Chris, you pointed out that we have 7 entities that are under US sanctions, and Huawei, of course, cannot touch Intel chipset upon which ORAN is built. So obviously they can't build it. So do they intend to actually deploy ORAN in China? Is that a real scenario, or why are they there? If I may put it that way.
I don't think there's any real evidence that they're going to deploy ORAN in China. The Chinese market is basically, let's say, again, round numbers, it's probably 90 to 95% Huawei ZTE plus, enough to throw at Ericsson and Nokia so that they will go back to Helsinki and Stockholm and advocate for openness for Huawei and ZTE in the Scandinavian markets. But there's little evidence of that. The primary reason that they are there, and you asked the question a couple minutes ago, how intentional was this? I think on the Chinese side, it's very intentional. Because, for instance, Huawei is left off with very clear reason. And some of the smaller companies, I think, are very interesting as to why they're there. There's a couple of these very small companies that have recently been started that are owned by Chinese billionaires that are in the National People's Congress. Okay, that seems very, very unlikely to be an accident. Okay. And on the U.S. side, I think you have to say, well, how much was by design and how much was intentional. I think you have to think, and from my conversations, I think it seemed much more accidental than in the sense that people just didn't do their due diligence as to what ORAN actually was. There was this idea that, oh, it's open, it's a new technological standard, and we're not going to do our due diligence as to who's actually involved. Where is the coding actually being done? What are the security standards that we are imposing upon telecom providers and manufacturers in driving this ORAN alliance?
Roslyn?
Hosuk, I think you need to remember, again, a security assessment has not been completed of ORAN. I mean, I find it so premature of this legislation that it puts forth the money for Open RAN, but no security assessment has been performed, either in the US or in the EU. Now, the EU has the tools, fortunately, with the 5G toolbox. I mean, I've hats off to all the policymakers who worked diligently on that, but they have not done the work to actually study the concepts, to study the technology. So we have legislation it put the cart before the horse. It said, here's the money, go and build it, but they didn't check whether it was the safer way to go. Now, so that is the again the problem, one of the problems here, and again I would also go back to, I think, again, there's not a problem with the infrastructure market. There are very sound companies involved, and that it is a smaller part of, increasingly small part of the actual cash flow that the operators are already paying. So, we have bigger issues to look at. The platforms, for example, that's where the money is. We should be putting our focus there.
That's well said. And I'm gonna throw out another question, because you brought Roslyn Europe back into the discussion here. First question I would have, taking this once again from the chat, is how much consideration is there about Europe, which is one of the closest allies of the United States? How much Europe thinking went to the Innovation and Competitiveness Act? That's my first question. And the follow-up question actually comes from a good friend of mine, Michael Nelson at Carnegie, who put a very good question and comparison, actually, that Europe is doing similar things, actually, in terms of industrial policy on data. He particularly points to Gaia X and attempt to collate all the data inside Europe by European industrial players. Is there a certain element of whataboutism here, that Europe is doing the same thing? America wants diversity in 5G. Europe wants to have diversity in platforms. Is there perhaps a transatlantic problem rather than a China problem? That's the question number two. Who would like to go first?
Well, I'll let me go first. And I've lived in Europe since 2010, and I've been studying in Europe for even longer than that. And I think there's a regulation problem. I mean, there was, at the turn of the century, there was a belief in the year 2000 that Europe was going to win in telecoms. It was going to be the internet of the future, and the telecom companies were going to win. And systematically, the European governments have regulated away every advantage that the European Union had. They wanted to attack the profits of the telecom operators, and with that, all of the ecosystem that the telecom money funded, the research, the institutes, the related industries, it dried up. And I know this myself, being at Aalborg University in Copenhagen. It used to be a Nokia research facility with 2,000 people. That ended overnight, because over time, just the predatory aspects of wrong-headed European regulation. If you look at what the EU has done to their attempt to regulate the platforms, has made American platforms even bigger in Europe today than they were 10 years ago. They have larger market share. Their profits have never been better. They have more users. So everything that they've done has actually handicapped European entities to innovate. They have a difficult time to get scale. So, and I'm actually quite, I wasn't surprised, but the GDPR, which promised to do all of these things and create new players, we are the farthest thing from that. there's minimal enforcement because it's expensive. The compliance is maybe half of the companies because it's extremely expensive, and companies just don't get started. So to me, that's the fundamental issue, is it is not a friendly place to innovate. Look at, for example, net neutrality rules we've had since Europe in 2015. You cannot point to one new application and one new service that has been invented in Europe since 2015 as a result of those rules. But nevertheless, Europe continues to regulate because it sounds good. So I think that US and Europe are in the same boat, where they like to make look good, feel good policy, which sounds great to some people's ears, but they don't do the work to actually measure what happens. And over time, people just give up or they leave. And we saw that they just say, this is not working. I don't want to be a part of it anymore. And I think it's quite unfortunate, because the great mobile innovation, GSM and so forth, it came out of Europe. It came out of Scandinavian countries and other places. Spain was Italy. All of these countries had tremendous innovation, and just regulation has dried it up.
We have a very interesting question about standards coming up after this, but Chris, let me tee it up. Actually, let me squeeze you a little bit harder. Is there really a consideration about Europe, or is Europe just a collateral damage? And in the end, this is the era of America first. And I always joke that even Democrats are American first and multilateralist second. They will reach, but no overreach, and go against their national interests to help Europe. And that's the way the transatlantic relationship always has been, friendly competition, and sometimes nice wing of backstabbing in both directions, I should add. And as someone who used to do trade negotiation, I can say that with safety, with some authority. Let me bring that to you. How much Europe consideration is this in this legislation, you think?
I think there is definitely. I do think it's part industrial planning, in the sense of that they would like to see an American, competitor in this specific space. At the same time, I think, I've never met one American, either just normal person or individual that's been in government, that is uncomfortable with the idea of Ericsson and Nokia being the dominant players. Okay, so in a way, I don't think that is as prominent as maybe it's made out to be. And I think one of the things that I remember during the Trump administration, I would talk to people, and some of them would get frustrated and say, "Look, we're actually pushing, Ericsson and Nokia, and we don't even have a horse in the race. Okay, we don't even have a company that is going to take business. So when we're trying to block Huawei, the natural beneficiaries are going to be Ericsson and Nokia." And so there was kind of some frustration that, from some of the Trump people, that they almost felt like they were doing more to protect Ericsson and Nokia than European governments were doing to, assist Ericsson and Nokia. So absolutely, let's not at all say that is zero consideration. It is. I think America would very much like that. At the same time, I think there is, and I think both the Trump administration and the Biden administration could do a much better job of basically pushing, as Roslyn has kind of mentioned it a couple of times, some type of democratic tech bloc, or something of that nature. And one of the things that I would personally love to see, is we talk about Europe, but especially on a lot of the basic manufacturing. This would seem to be a perfect role for India to fulfill. If Foxconn can roll out an iPhone manufacturing plant in India in a year, there's very little reason why it would seem some of these companies couldn't, some other companies couldn't do the same in India and say, look, we are a China-free tech product.
I should point out, for factual correctness, that there is, and to give China a little bit of a break, that it's not all benevolence on the side of US, because although they are Scandinavian brand names, Nokia and Ericsson and Samsung, they have considerable amount of assets in the United States. They have also acquired US companies. So you have yeah, you have European brand names, but the substantive part of them is also American. So it's not all we help the foreigners and there is no protectionist involved. Roslyn, did you want to come in on the same question here?
I would just say, I don't think that I don't think that Europeans were considered, or even Americans. I really think that this policy is really corporation first. It is what, these large American, the Intels, the Qualcomms, it's what they want. And it isn't imagined on the level of truly what is best for American people's individual privacy or security, or Europeans for that matter. What works for those corporations, which sounds good, which can be marketed as as a policy. So, for that respect, I think we have, unfortunately left the vote, the individuals in the lurch.
And one thing, if I can just jump in there real quick, is basically in the actual legislation goes directly to what Roslyn is saying, is that the legislation is all about increased competition, funding for research in these areas, and there's zero, and so the politicians will talk about China, but the actual wording of the legislation has nothing to do with those specific issues.
We have talked a lot about the players now, and I'm also glad that we ventured into some of the specific details in surprising detail on some of the players, both in the US and China. But we have also a question that came in from Paul Timmers, a former EU official, and who posed actually a very interesting question, which is not about the actors, but actually about the format. ORAM is not a standard setting forum, it is a private specification. They're actually doing technical specification, developing code together. So in that way, they are more of an, alliance, they call themselves alliance, but also a form of let's say, consortium to jointly, rather than producing a jet, they're actually producing a lines of code together. Americans and Chinese developers sing a kumbaya. We Europeans love it. And but coming back to the question about, is there a problem with the format? Because what Paul is asking here is that should industry-led digital standardization, and especially in critical technology, be more anchored in government involvement? Because in the end, this is what China does, he writes, indirectly anyway, through state-owned enterprises and, Chinese academia that is primarily state coordinated. And you could probably make the same argument at least about the European R&D, but in the end, basically taking things for what they are and say, okay, let's get the governments involved. Markets have partially failed, so the SDOs, the standard designated organization in Europe, you have ETSI, and you have a couple of organizations in the United States who are the counterparts of this, who together form, for example, the Global Forum at 3GPP. We have the work in the ITU, which is purely driven by governments. Should the government take responsible action here and basically represent the companies rather than companies representing the countries? I think that at least that's what Paul's question is. If not, I just made it so.
So I'll tell you just from my perspective, and I don't mean this, it's probably going to sound harsher than it is intended. But one of the things is that in my experience, government workers are always 3 to 5 years behind where the tech actually is and what's actually happening in tech. And so I'm generally reluctant to give them authority over standard or technical, technical standards. And I should say ORAM kind of fits, it's not really standard setting, it's not really purely technical research either. It's kind of an odd mixture of both. And I think he's entirely right about, this is how China indirectly gets in and controls and moves these entities. So to circle back to, what should be done? I think the fundamental failure of ORAN was twofold. First of all, there were no security requirements placed upon ORAN, the money, and the standard that was being set. And so they said, hey, we'll work with the ORAN members, who are network service providers, telcos, said we have no problem working with Chinese manufacturers because that's who we've dealt with in the past. When the entire purpose from a public policy perspective was to move away from Chinese entities. So because there were no security standards, I think that basically gave the ORAN Alliance and telco providers free rein to go use those security risks.
Yeah, I want to bring in Roslyn here because I think this is also more of a structural organizational question, and you follow this space way for a long time at least. I didn't mean to imply your age, but we had United States going in and out of international standard setting, funding NIST, defunding NIST, and then getting back it again by supporting the companies and then not doing anything at all and saying that it should be all market-led. What's your take here to Paul's question? Should the governments, what's the ideal model for this industry, considering that you are the lead expert on this in this development? How should the future standard developments be set?
Well, what I would say is, we have many processes where the government is involved and extremely involved. If you look at through the dual-use technologies, this has been going on for 25 years. In fact, it's the 25th anniversary of the Wassenaar Arrangement that was developed and that's managed in Vienna. Every year, all the parties of that, it's the 41 nations, they are discussing and agreeing and developing the set of export controls and what should be controlled at which point. And then each country has to ratify those agreements. The United States, many levels of government are involved in that, and certainly in the European nations. Where that breaks down is frequently, it's not in the agreements, it's in the implementation. So we have, for example, at the Department of Commerce today, the U.S. went through a major process in 2018 where it reformed its export control regime. And the issue has been that the Department of Commerce has not implemented the reforms. It's now 3 years hence that there are so many Chinese companies which should be restricted today, which are not, because American companies lobby Department of Commerce to foreclose those restrictions taking place. What's interesting now is the signal that maybe a Department of Defense representative will come in and manage that office, that the security concerns will actually be taken seriously and brought to the attention. So I think that the standards setting organizations are very important. They play an extremely important role. They have definitely been, how would you say, co-opted by a lot of Chinese actors. They send huge delegations. They have taken leadership roles in this. And I think that, Western nations have kind of let it happen. I mean, they have had a difficult time to push back. So there are other guardrails, if you will, that is the export control process. So I think that is an appropriate way for the government to be involved, but they actually have to enforce the laws that are on the books. So, that is sort of what I would say, that we have regulation there to address these security concerns, but they're not followed. They are, in many cases, too weak. They are not implemented, or they take too much time, or what have you. And so, if in fact we just followed the laws in the books, we would be in a better place.
That's very interesting. And to your point, number one rule of standardization work is to show up. And China did, we didn't. So kudos to them. I think we need to be fair there, that they actually showed up and we didn't. So maybe I'll end this as a final question to you both, that ORAN is quite interesting in a way that it's not bifurcation in supply chains, but it's actually bifurcation in standardization, or at least an attempt to break away from CGPP, not necessarily China, but you have different ways of, divorcing from the geopolitical adversary. One is in transaction supply chains, or the other one is in standardization. Is this what we're seeing? I mean, I'm not putting any values here in terms of whether it's good or bad, that countries are going back to balkanization. At least I'm old enough to remember those days. I had to rent a phone whenever I went to the United States because we were not compatible back in the wonderful 2G days. Chris, can we get a 1-minute comment from you and we'll end on Roslyn?
Sure. I do think with regards to China specifically, you absolutely are seeing a separation. A lot of firms are already moving to, let's say, Chinese and non-Chinese operations, even in how they store their data and run their networks and the products that they produce. I absolutely think with regards to China specifically, I don't think you're likely to see that as much between democratic countries like Japan, Europe, the United States.
All right. Roslyn?
Well, the standardization is extremely important to industry and enterprise. I mean, the ability to sell same or similar products across as large geographies as possible, you know, that I think that you have a very hard time finding anyone who doesn't think that that's important. The issue has been to make sure that the security is real, and that, you know, where you have 32 senators who are not supporting this Innovation Act, I think speaks to that they don't believe that when you assert that ORAN is the silver bullet to the Chinese problem, they do not recognize that. And, you know, that they see that there's an opportunity here for abuse. And it's important for people to wake up that we actually, if we're going to say it's secure, the assessment has to be done. We also have to look at the supply chain, and we can't accept, you know, a label on the top of everything without looking at who's producing it and where.
I think that's a very good final point, and where we started from the U.S. industrial policy, reimagining of the U.S. industrial policy, ending on the point of, well, future bifurcation and the role of innovation going forward. And if I may just add one word, industrial policy tend to sometimes have common component, which is that you throw money at something until it works, and it never works. And on that topic, we are actually going to invite a few Chinese scholars to discuss about the failures and the success of Chinese industrial policy and why that didn't work, and why they are flabbergasted to see US and Europe repeating Chinese mistakes, which we'll be having the opportunity to come back to. And also on that note, thank you to both, and you're welcome back anytime. And thank you so much for well, gracing us with your wisdom and your thoughts. Very provocative at times and very always thoughtful. It's been great to have you here, and I also like to thank the audience for their great questions. And I'm sure that your contacts are available on the internet, so that, and the social media. So I'm sure that several of them will reach out to you and ask further questions. So without further ado, thank you so much. And this will also be the first ECIPE event that ends ahead of schedule. So thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.